Hi everyone, welcome back to this channel. I hope you are all doing good. What really happens when people try to weaponize history and it completely backfires? Right now, there is a heated conversation that is spreading online where some individuals are attempting to intimidate Black Americans by invoking the painful history of slavery, but instead of fear, instead of submission or silence, they are being met with something entirely different. So, guys, let me roll these clips. I'll be coming back with more commentaries. And you know what? There are a lot of unexpected reactions. It's making a lot of people furious. Let me roll these clips. I'll be coming back with more commentaries. And in case of any thoughts, kindly feel free to let me know in the comment section. Otherwise, stay tuned.
So Arizona, in May in 2022, we're trying to push for the Supreme Court to rule that incarcerated people cannot prove their innocence to exonerate them. And we know in the 13th Amendment there is a clause that says slavery is abolished with the exception of incarceration for a crime. And most people who have been exonerated and proven their innocence have been Black people. I say that to say that we may not have slavery the way that our ancestors experienced it. It has not been officially abolished and eradicated. With the way that the Supreme Court is going and the way that some of these laws that are being passed are making things illegal, slavery may look very differently. And I feel like it could be sooner than we think. I do believe that they're going.
Yes, literally. Everything ties back to slavery in this country because it was built off of slavery. Like slavery was embedded into the fabrics of American society. So we can't overlook the effects, right? We can't try to address the effects of the problem with overlooking the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is slavery. And it's in every single industry. And I also want us to conceptualize how big slavery actually was. I guess the easiest way I can liken it is to like the global agriculture system or the global tech industrial system. Think about how big tech is. Think about how big tech is or how big agriculture is. Like the reason why we saw an increase in grain and wheat and all of those products increase, the reason we saw that is because Russia and Ukraine have like a serious hold, like a 30% market hold on grain globally. And so if you just so happen to dismantle a system here, it inadvertently is going to affect you elsewhere. That's what synchronicities are. It's, yes, you don't have to directly be impacted, but you can indirectly be impacted, and it's just as bad. So when we look at how slavery, like the removal of slavery and the rights being granted to formerly enslaved persons, well, how did that have a devastating and crippling effect on our economy? Well, we saw the creation of the Black Codes, which then eventually evolved into Jim Crow. And then from there, we saw the need for mass migration. So that's where Ellis Island became like this major stronghold. And it was the idea of the American dream because you had to sell people on that. You had to sell them on opportunity, which is where they came up with the concept of the American dream and the Industrial Revolution that really created the mechanized movement. So, and then you started seeing like the vehicle, the automobile come about, and how Henry Ford, although he was not the first one who created the vehicle, he was the one that created the assembly line and mass production. And you needed people, you needed bodies to do that, and you no longer had free labor. And so they were going to exploit as much as they possibly could from a eager and willing migrant class. Here's the issue, is they were not willing to accept the conditions that Black Americans were forced to endure. They were not willing to do that at all. They were not willing to do that. And as a result, that's where you start to see collective bargaining. the rise of unions, which then led to the rise of human resources because companies saw, hey, it might be a bit cheaper if we internalize these processes, and this way we get to have a say so on how we actually enforce this stuff. But there was also laws that were being passed, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Those laws were being passed, and so it was forcing these companies, these major conglomerates like Rockefeller, to actually participate in a system that he was intentionally trying to dismantle. Now, I also want to touch on the fact that, these conglomerates, like Rockefeller and Ford, they're the ones that's responsible for the modern day education system. There's a reason why we have, kids go to school the same time that we go to work. And that there's a bell that's rung, and our system, our structure is set up the same way. Essentially, it's to create the best factory worker, the person who doesn't ask any questions, the person who shows up, does what they're supposed to do, and goes where they're supposed to be. And there you go, they're not a problem. The ones who can't conform to it become problematic. And so we used to weed them out and easily imprison them, which is why there is a school to prison pipeline, but that existed prior to the crack epidemic. But all of this stuff is entrenched within one another, all of it. And it's so crazy. If you were to just pull the thread and actually see all of the other connecting points, you'd see that it always goes back to slavery. Always.
Bring me the native.
Slavery in America was not some abstract sin we can tidy up with footnotes and cartoons. It was a daily terror, a system built on the breaking of human beings until they were stripped of name, lineage, and hope. To be enslaved was to live every waking moment under the threat of violence so casual it was indistinguishable from the weather. A whip split your back for moving too slowly. A lash fell for daring to look a man in the eye. A child was sold away from his mother as easily as a mule, and the screams that followed were drowned out by the auctioneer's call for bids. There is no softening this. There is no clever spin that makes bondage preferable. It was a theft of life day after day for generations. Enslaved men and women were forced into fields before dawn, bending their bodies until their backs were warped, until their hands bled and toughened into knots of scar tissue. They harvested cotton in the heat of Mississippi summers, and rice and swamps and tobacco that clung to their lungs like poison. They were denied shoes and medicine, denied even their own names, whipped for praying, whipped for speaking their mother tongue, whipped for showing the smallest flicker of resistance in their eyes. The women endured an additional hell. They were prey in their own cabins, subject to the whims of these masters. Rape was not an aberration, but an institution, a weapon used to produce more property children born already enslaved. Their fate sealed at birth. Husbands stood powerless. Wives endured silently or fought and suffered worse. Daughters learned too soon that they had no protection. Every intimacy was violated. Every relationship was shadowed by the knowledge that it could be destroyed in an instant by a sales slip or an owner's design.
Talk. Here, take the peace pipe. Her name's Penelope Cruz. A lot of our history has been erased on purpose. And when you think of slavery, you think of the African slave trade. But did you know that we were slaves for 100 years longer than black people? And 100 years prior? And slavery supposedly ended in 1865 for black people. But there were reports of native slaves up into the 1920s. I said 1920s. This video is not Oppression Olympics, black people versus natives. Don't do that. But we were slaves for 100 years longer than black people, and they just swept that shit under the rug. You are a descendant of slaves. And after the first 100 years of slavery, some, not all, it was like 4 of them, after 100 years of slavery, some of the tribes that were deemed Christianized, humanized, depigmatized, white nationalized, they started enslaving us and black people. Enslaving the rival tribes that would not fuck with slavery. The ones that managed to keep some culture intact. Because for black people, they snatched them up away from their land and their culture, everything gone. But for natives, they had to destroy our culture and our world around us. And black people were seen as American citizens before we were because reservations were a form of segregation. We were considered to be not a part of America, which is why we have our own separate tribal governments, our own identification cards. Because, mama, we fought slavery for hundreds of years. But the reality is that no black person and no native person, no indigenous person in America was ever truly free until the Civil Rights Act. Or maybe it was the Voting Act, Lyndon Johnson, or maybe both. Google that shit. And I don't know how to verbalize this in any better way because this is Kush. But the story of slavery does not belong solely to black people, and the oppression that black people face will not end unless native oppression also ends, and vice versa. Even if most people aren't educated on it, our story and trauma is intrinsically connected. And we need to be working together. Like they had the Black Panthers, we should have had the Black Bear, the Black Horse or some shit. Girl, I don't know. You feel what I mean. But you're a descendant of slaves. And some of you are even descendant of slaves who then went on to own slaves. I don't want to start any drama, but one of those slave-owning tribes was the Cherokee. You didn't hear it from me.
You know what, guys? I can say what really happens when fear tactics stop working. What happens when a painful history is brought up, not to heal, but to intimidate? And what happens when the people it's meant to affect simply don't react the way they expected? Because right now, a conversation is unfolding that is leaving a lot of people frustrated and others are completely unmoved. We are seeing across social media and public discourse, there's been a noticeable shift. Some voices are trying to invoke the history of slavery, not as a lesson, but as a warning, a reminder of power, a suggestion of what once was. But instead of fear, the reaction has been something very different. Slavery, is one of the darkest chapters in history. It is not just a talking point, it's trauma, it's resilience, survival, and legacy. For generations, that history has shaped identity, it has shaped struggle and progress, but it has also built something else, that is strength. So when that same history is used today in a way that feels threatening or dismissive, it does not land the same way it might have decades ago. And instead of fear, many people are responding with indifference or even pushback. Why? Because times have changed, information is everywhere, voices are louder, and narratives are no longer controlled by a single perspective. What used to silence people now sparks conversation. What used to intimidate now gets questioned. And for some, this lack of reaction is confusing, even frustrating. They expected emotion, they expected fear, they expected compliance, but what they are seeing instead is confidence and sometimes complete disengagement. And that shift, it challenges long held assumptions about power, about influence, and control. And this is not just about one moment or one conversation, it is about how history is used and who gets to define its meaning today. Or is it a tool for education or a weapon for intimidation? Because the way people respond now shows something important. History can shape you, but it does not have to control you. Yes, so the real question is what happens next when old tactics stop working, when narratives shift, and when people refuse to react the way they once did? Does the conversation evolve or does it escalate? Let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, all credit belongs to the original creators of the video. And this video is meant for educational purposes and commentary purposes as well. Let me know what you think. And also, if you want more breakdowns like this, don't forget to subscribe.